Freedom of speech, the ability to express yourself. It's a cherished idea, as well it should be. Most of us who live in liberal Western democracies think of it as a basic human right. People have fought and died for it. But now we may be in danger of losing it. The threat is not coming from without, from external enemies, but from within. A generation is being raised not to believe in freedom of speech, but rather that they should have freedom from speech they dislike. This is a threat to both pluralism and democracy itself. We see this in Europe, where sensitivity-based censorship attempts to ban anything deemed hateful or even just hurtful, and to ban criticism of religion, especially Islam. But the United States, despite its strong constitutional protections in the Bill of Rights, is far from immune from the rising trend of suppression of speech, or what is sometimes called political correctness. This is especially true at America's colleges and universities, the place where our future leaders are educated and where you'd expect speech to be the most free. Highly restrictive speech codes are now the norm on campus, not the exception. According to a study by my organization, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, FIRE, 54% of public universities and 59% of private universities impose politically correct speech codes on their students. And thanks to recent Department of Education guidelines, 100% of colleges may adopt speech codes in the coming years. How bad is it? At a public campus in California on Constitution Day in 2013, a student who also happens to be a decorated military veteran was told he could not hand out copies of the Constitution to his fellow students. The objection from the university was not ideological. It was out-of-control bureaucracy imposing limits on speech. That same day, another college student in that same state was told he could not protest NSA surveillance outside of a tiny free speech zone, an area that comprised only 1.37% of the campus. Months later, college students in Hawaii were told both they could not hand out the Constitution to their fellow students, and that they could not protest NSA policies outside the school's free speech zone. FIRE took these colleges to court, but the fact that we had to shows you how bad it has become. Recently, students and sympathetic faculty have joined forces to exclude campus speakers whose opinions they dislike. At FIRE, we call this disinvitation season, although the season lasts all year round. Since 2009, there has been a major uptick in the push by students and faculty to get speakers they dislike disinvited. These speakers have included former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, the Somali-born feminist and critic of Islam, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and the director of the International Monetary Fund, Christine Lagarde. And that's only the obvious part of the disinvitation problem. Few conservative speakers are invited to speak at colleges lest they have to be disinvited later. The newest threat to speech comes from so-called trigger warnings, alerts that warn students that they are about to read or hear something that triggers a negative emotional response. A 2014 New York Times article cited the example of a Rutgers student requesting trigger warnings for the classic American novel The Great Gatsby because it, quote, possesses a variety of scenes that reference abusive, misogynistic violence, unquote. Recently, Oberlin College attempted to institute a policy that heavily encouraged the faculty to avoid difficult topics and to employ trigger warnings as a means of making classrooms safer. Safety has been watered down to essentially mean the right to always feel comfortable. New demands for trigger warnings are popping up on campuses across the country. Add in popular academic theories that encourage students to scrutinize speech for microaggressions, any statement that might be construed as racially insensitive, classist, sexist, or otherwise un-PC, and it's clear that campuses are teaching students to police what they say. This is precisely the opposite of what is needed. Our society needs candor, and it needs freedom of speech, not freedom from speech. Intellectual comfort is not a right, nor should it ever be. Not if we want freedom of speech, let's just call it freedom, to survive. I'm Greg Lukianoff, president of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education for Prager University.
What's in a word? Why does it matter whether we call someone who breaks the law to enter the country an illegal alien or an undocumented immigrant? What's the difference between a Christmas tree and a holiday tree? It's just semantics, right? Yes. And no. It is just semantics, but semantics means the meaning of words. Words exist so that we might discriminate one thing from another. Without words, we have chaos. And it starts with the first words. A baby says mama to distinguish mommy from daddy. Words shape how we think. They color how we view the world. No one understands this better than the left. They are the masters of words, because they know that words matter. The left has a special gift for euphemisms, soft words selected to sugarcoat harsh realities so as to make those harsh realities easier for us to swallow. But these soft words are insidious. Their sole purpose is to deceive. Race discrimination in hiring and college admissions is refashioned as the much nicer-sounding affirmative action. Who would ever oppose an affirmative action? Global warming, which can be measured and challenged, has morphed into climate change, which means essentially nothing because the climate is always changing. When Barack Obama became president, George Bush's war in Afghanistan suddenly transformed into the far less ominous and threatening Overseas Contingency Operation. That's one way to try to end a war, just rename it. The examples are endless. There's a new euphemism every week. In the make-believe world of leftist language, young criminals have become justice-involved youth. Mandates and taxes are individual shared responsibility payments. Government spending becomes an investment. Wanting to keep more of your hard-earned money becomes greed. Taking more of someone else's money is them paying their fair share. Opposing a Democrat in the White House is obstruction. Opposing a Republican in the White House, resistance. In the name of diversity, the left enforces intellectual conformity. It censors opposing views in the name of tolerance, and it labels all non-left views hate speech. Consider the ongoing battle over pronouns, whether to call a man who thinks he's a woman he or she. Very few people in the country suffer from gender confusion, and we should have compassion for those who do. But the left has invested countless funds, time, and energy to make everyone refer to some men as she and some women as he. Why? Is it because the left is so compassionate? Or is it more likely because so much of the left's cultural agenda is about blurring, even denying, the natural distinctions between men and women? Sometimes it's just an adjective that can change or even negate the entire meaning of the word it describes. Take social justice. Justice means getting what you deserve without favor. Social justice means getting what you don't deserve because you are favored. Here's one we hear a lot these days. My truth. Truth is reality regardless of any individual's feelings or perceptions. My truth is how I perceive things regardless of how they really are. And how about same-sex marriage? Let's not get into the politics. Let's just look at the language. Throughout history, in every culture, marriage has been the union of husbands, men, and wives, women. Same-sex marriage is the union of men with men or women with women, but it is most certainly not the union of husbands and wives. Once the phrase same-sex was placed before the word marriage, that is, once the definition of marriage changed, the debate changed. It became about marriage equality. It was suddenly an act of bigotry to limit marriage to husbands and wives. All this manipulation of language has paid off for the left, because whoever controls the words controls the culture. Don't believe me? Just try using plain language instead of the left's politically correct jargon. But be careful. Use the wrong words, and you might lose your job, your home, and your reputation. The culture war is largely a war of words. Right now, the left is winning. You can see the consequences everywhere, in politics, in education, in media. It's time to fight back. We should not cede another syllable. What's in a word? Everything. I'm Michael Knowles, host of The Michael Knowles Show for Prager University.
I know what it's like to walk into a room where plain truth seems like a foreign concept, where just speaking your mind can feel daunting, where the founding principles of the United States of America are openly ridiculed. For 2 years, I served as the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. Just to give you an idea of how strange things can get at the UN, consider that the Human Rights Council is dominated by some of the world's worst human rights offenders, countries like China, Cuba, and Venezuela. True democracies like Israel are routinely abused, and America, the nation that has protected the God-given rights of hundreds of millions of people all over the globe, is openly criticized. Why am I telling you this? Because most college campuses have become as anti-American, which is to say morally backward, as the UN. And the only person who can set it right side up is you. If that sounds like I'm asking you to shoulder a heavy burden, that's because I am. I wouldn't be asking if I didn't think you were up to it. I fully believe that you are. I've spoken at a lot of colleges. I'm convinced that most of the students still have a strong, intuitive love of our country. That's why I'm optimistic about America's future. But I know that it's hard to speak out. I know the academic establishment is against you. I didn't say this was going to be easy. It is, however, going to be necessary. So what is it that I'm asking you to do? Be brave. Defend your right to speak out. Defend America. To your friends, in class, around campus, wherever you go. Speaking out doesn't mean being rude, and of course it never means resorting to violence. It means having the facts and saying the truth with clarity and purpose. And if you're saying the truth, don't back down, even if your classmates or professor, or in my case, the representatives of 193 governments, try to make you look foolish. Defending America means you need to know American history. Given how poorly that history is taught these days, you might have to supplement your education. Start with the primary sources, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, George Washington's farewell speech, the Gettysburg Address, and Lincoln's second inaugural. And build out from there. Discover America's history for yourself. Make up your own mind. Always remember that you're comparing America to reality, not to utopia. Also remember that you have to judge people in the context of their time, not by the standards of our time. If you do that, I have every confidence you'll find yourself loving this country as much as I do. America has a great story to tell, but first you have to have the courage to tell it. What the fight for racial equality was to prior generations, the fight for free speech and intellectual freedom is to your generation. You are on the front line. You are the rebel. Never before in my lifetime can I remember when more Americans were as stifled or as constantly told what they're allowed to think and what they're allowed to say. And what are we allowed to say in America? What sorts of fashionable ideas are considered sophisticated by our top universities? So often, they're the very same ones espoused by the thugs on the Human Rights Council. That America is racist, that capitalism, the only economic system to lift billions of people out of poverty, is the source of our problems, that socialism is bliss, that freedom of speech is not that important. These are very bad ideas. They're also dead wrong. There is no question that America can and should improve. That's the hard work we have in front of us. But the constant slandering of American democracy and the opportunity it offers to everyone is a one-way street to a much worse future. We don't need to remake America into something different. America isn't perfect. It's also not an accident that we are the most generous, most prosperous, and most free country for people of every race, ethnicity, and religion in world history. In my time in the UN, I got to know countries where there are no protections for speech. Countries where you risk a lot more than online harassment or a bad grade if you oppose the ruling party positions. Everything of value comes with a price, but that price will be worth it because America is worth it. Speaking the truth is often difficult, so it takes courage to do so. Many have died to preserve America and liberty. No one's asking you to risk your life, but it is now your generation's turn to step up, or you will lose both your country and your freedom. I'm Nikki Haley for Prager University.
This video was made possible by a generous grant from Colorado Christian University. PragerU subscribers may be eligible for a $1,000 scholarship for courses taken through CCU Online. Learn more at prageru.com/CCU.
If you want to control people's thoughts, begin by controlling their words. That's totalitarian thinking. It was once completely foreign to America. Not anymore. Increasingly, Americans are forced to use language against their will or even their conscience, or be prepared to suffer the consequences. And those consequences can be dire. Take, for example, the issue of transgenderism, the newest civil rights battle of our time. A decade ago, few people could even tell you what the word transgender meant. Today, expressing the wrong opinion on the issue can cost you your business or job or both. Consider recent state and local actions punishing those who decline to use an individual's pronouns of choice. In 2017, California Governor Jerry Brown signed legislation threatening jail time for healthcare professionals who willfully and repeatedly refuse to use a patient's preferred pronouns. Under guidelines issued in 2015 by New York City's Commission on Human Rights, employers, landlords, and business owners who intentionally use the wrong pronoun with transgender workers and tenants face potential fines of as much as $250,000. That's a steep price for saying he instead of she instead of he, or even he or she instead of they. What about the vast majority of citizens who hold the biology-based view that chromosomes determine your sex, male or female? Or those who have a deep-seated religious conviction that sex is both biological and binary, God's purposeful creation. In December of 2018, Peter Vlamming was fired from his job as a French language teacher in a Virginia school district because he refused to refer to a transgender student by the student's preferred pronouns. Vlamming's Christian belief prevented him from bowing before the notion that the student who had been a she in his class the year before was now suddenly a he. Vlamming was willing to use the student's chosen new name, but he avoided using any pronouns when referring to this student. That wasn't good enough for the school district. They needed to hear him say the words. You don't have to be religious to believe that one person can never be a they. The Supreme Court has clearly decided that compelled speech is not free speech. In West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett, the Supreme Court upheld the student's right to refuse to salute an American flag. Justice Robert Jackson wrote, "If there is any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, religion, or other matters of opinion." And, Jackson went on to say, the state can't force people to say things they don't believe. But this is precisely what's happening. People are forced to refer to others as they or co or thon. Yes, those are now considered pronouns. What might otherwise be a courtesy now has criminal consequences. In most contexts, I would have no problem addressing others in any manner they chose, and I'm sure most Americans feel the same. But the Constitution's protection of free speech neither begins nor ends with good manners. It extends all the way from rudeness to meekness, protecting those who hurl insults and those who would prefer to say nothing at all. If the state can compel the use of certain words, it can force those who differ into silence. It can force its citizens to parrot beliefs they do not hold. The Fairfax County School District in Virginia removed the phrase biological gender from its curriculum and replaced it with the phrase sex assigned at birth. This is how the left legislates away the concept of biological sex without ever having to make the argument, without ever having to convince anyone. They're trying to make sex assigned at birth as trivial and malleable as name assigned at birth, as if some doctor arbitrarily chose for you on the day you were born. To the extent that the transgender movement seeks to promote compassion for those who struggle with their biological sex, we should be grateful for it. To the extent that it seeks to use government power to regulate our perspectives, commanding that we ignore biology and common sense, we should resist it. This is no small issue. The Constitution guarantees freedom of speech so that political issues can be worked out in the public square. But the activist left doesn't want that conversation to occur. They want to force the adoption of their conclusions before the argument even begins. Compelled speech is the tactic they've chosen. It's unconstitutional, it's undemocratic, and it's wrong. If gender activists prevail, we may be left with a world we neither recognize nor like very much. We won't be able to communicate our displeasure. We will have lost the words. I'm Abigail Schreier for Prager University.
The world has become too absurd to be satirized. The great English writer G.K. Chesterton said that way back in 1911, long before math was considered racist and biological men were allowed to compete against women in sports. One can only imagine what he would say if he were alive today. At the Babylon Bee, where we write satire for a living, we're feeling Chesterton's pain in a big way. Just look at these headlines that were satirical at the time we wrote them. On May 9th, 2017, we ran this headline: 2 + 2 = 4, insists close-minded bigot. That was a joke, of course. But on August 10th, 2020, the Washington Examiner published this story. Math professor claims equation 2 + 2 = 4 reeks of white supremacist patriarchy. On August 13th, 2020, we ran this headline: BLM rioters awarded Nobel Peace Prize. At the time, we thought this was obvious satire, but on January 29th, 2021, this story was published in The Guardian. Black Lives Matter movement nominated for Nobel Peace Prize. On March 25th, 2020, we ran this headline: Pants sales plummet as everyone working from home. The very next day, this story appeared in Yahoo Finance. Amid coronavirus, Walmart says it's seeing increased sales of tops, but not bottoms. I could go on. Our satirical headlines are proving to be prophetic with astonishing regularity. So what does this mean for humor and satire? Well, for one thing, it makes our job much more difficult. You might be surprised to hear that. The crazier reality is, the easier it is to make fun of, right? Actually, it's the opposite. Satire exaggerates the truth to make a point, but when reality is this absurd and extreme views and behavior are commonplace, how do you go a step beyond it? Almost anything we publish now ends up being believable, and much of it ends up actually coming true, as you've just seen. This is exactly what Chesterton was talking about. It's one of the ways the left is killing satire, by turning reality into a parody of itself. There's another, more intentional and insidious way the left is killing satire, and that's through censorship. We published an article a couple of years ago with this over-the-top headline: CNN purchases industrial-sized washing machine to spin news before publication. Believe it or not, Snopes fact-checked this story. I mean, come on, a washing machine to spin the news? That's an obvious joke. But Snopes fact-checked it and rated it false, as if we'd written a serious story. It used to be that jokes were either funny or not. They made you laugh, or they didn't. But now, in the fact-checking age, we're giving them a truth rating. Jokes are no longer funny, they're false, and false information is dangerous. In response to the Snopes fact-check, Facebook warned us that we'd be demonetized and deplatformed if we continued publishing fake news. It should go without saying that there's a big difference between fake news, which is meant to deceive, and satire, which is meant to entertain and inform through mockery, humor, and irony. But the left benefits by blurring this distinction. If they can successfully lump us in with fake news, then they can shut us down. It's that simple. These fact checks, which often smear us by suggesting we're purposefully misleading people, are nothing more than a creative, conniving way of justifying censorship. But why would anyone want to censor satire? Why is Facebook paying USA Today to write lengthy refutations of our jokes? Yes, they actually do that. Because humor is ultimately a vehicle for truth delivery, and the truth can be offensive. Think about all the things you're not allowed to say anymore, not because they're false, but because they make people uncomfortable. Satire cuts right through the pretense and political correctness to expose uncomfortable truths, and it does so more ruthlessly and effectively than anything else. C.S. Lewis said, "Good philosophy must exist if for no other reason because bad philosophy needs to be answered." Satire is necessary for the same reason. Satire ridicules bad ideas. And now, more than ever, bad ideas need to be exposed for what they are before they gain an even bigger foothold on our minds and hearts, especially on the minds and hearts of young people. And while good philosophy and rational argumentation are indispensable, it's often humor that's most effective. To quote our friend G.K. Chesterton once more, humor can get in under the door, while seriousness is still fumbling at the handle. I'm Seth Dillon, CEO of the Babylon Bee for Prager University.
Neil Golightly had a long and distinguished career as an executive at Boeing, until he didn't. Gary Garrels had a long and distinguished career as a curator of painting and sculpture at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, until he didn't. James Bennett had a long and distinguished career as an editor at the New York Times, until he didn't. All three were canceled. Their careers, their life's work ended in a virtual instant. Golightly wrote an article 30 years ago objecting to women taking part in military combat. It was published in Proceedings, the magazine of the U.S. Naval Institute. Somehow it came to the attention of an employee at Boeing who found it sexist. The social media mob got riled up. Golightly apologized, of course. His views had changed in the intervening decades. But it didn't matter. He was forced to resign. Garrels conducted a presentation about purchasing art from more racially diverse artists by saying that he would still continue to buy art from white artists. This outraged the staff at the museum, who found his remarks smacking of white supremacy. Garrels apologized, of course. He should have been more sensitive to his colleagues' feelings, he said. But it didn't matter. He was forced to resign. Bennett published an opinion piece by Republican Senator Tom Cotton, arguing that if the Black Lives Matter-inspired riots continued to overwhelm local police, the federal government should send in the National Guard to restore order. New York Times staff claimed that Cotton's words were threatening. They personally felt endangered by them. They demanded Bennett's head. Bennett apologized, of course. He just thought the Times readers should be exposed to a different point of view. But it didn't matter. He was forced to resign. Former Times columnist Barry Weiss perfectly described the situation in her resignation letter shortly after Bennett's banishment. Twitter is not on the masthead of the New York Times, but Twitter has become its ultimate editor. This is the cancel culture that now pervades America. Yet, people on the left, the very people responsible for it, claim it doesn't exist. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez mocks those who fear its growing influence. Odds are you're not actually canceled, she tweeted. You're just being challenged, held accountable, or unliked. The representatives claim that this is merely accountability culture is common on the left. Don't believe it. Accountability means a duty to explain. Accountability involves confronting a person with their actions in a way that allows them to explain themselves or ask for forgiveness, and otherwise continue the dialogue. The purpose of cancellation is very different. It seeks to bring all conversation to an end, to strike fear in the public so that no one else dares to speak up. That is cancellation, and it extends far beyond criticism. Cancellation involves social media mobs engaged in public shaming and the creation of blacklists. It seeks the destruction of the career and reputation of anyone who differs with a leftist position. The bullies, says social critic Douglas Murray, want to stop the rest of us talking or thinking. Virtually no one is immune. Not Kevin Hart, not J.K. Rowling, not Woodrow Wilson, not Drew Brees. Not the famous or the unknown, not the living or the dead. So many have been burned at the social media stake. One has to wonder if the mob is going to run out of victims. But this fire will not burn itself out. We have to stop it. How? First, if you ever find yourself in the cancel culture crosshairs, don't apologize to the mob. Apologize when you've done something wrong, not when you've exercised a constitutional right. And furthermore, your apology won't save you. It merely hands the bullies another victory. Stand firm. The storm will pass. The mob always moves on. Second, find allies among reasonable people, not necessarily people who vote the way you do or agree with you on every issue, just people who still believe in free speech and are committed to open dialogue. Third, The rest of us must only support institutions and businesses that value free expression. Money talks, which is why cancel culture is such a potent weapon. People and even big businesses are terrified of losing their incomes. Finally, defend targets of the mob, wherever they fall on the political spectrum. This is a free speech issue. It should unite liberals and conservatives against the left. The very soul of our republic depends on an open exchange of ideas. We must take on and defeat a cancel culture that would hold a free people hostage in their own society. I'm Paris Denard for Prager University.
This video was made possible by a generous donation from the Jaquish and Kenninger Foundation.
The year is 1984. One company, Microsoft, dominates the computer world. It's their way or the highway, conform or die. This snapshot in time was perfectly captured in one of the most famous commercials in TV history. Set in a gray dystopian future, row after row of men stare blankly at a giant screen from which Big Brother, the all-powerful leader from George Orwell's classic novel 1984, addresses them. Suddenly, riot police burst into the hall, chasing a beautiful blonde woman in a white shirt and red shorts. Before they can grab her, she hurls a sledgehammer into the screen, shattering Big Brother and his grip on the masses. The narrator informs us that Apple's breakthrough product, the Macintosh computer, will be the device that sets us all free. Looking back, Apple largely lived up to its promise. A new wave of companies, each in its own way, followed the example set by Apple's legendary CEO, Steve Jobs. Google gave us instant access to vast amounts of information. Facebook gave us a new way to connect with friends, family, and the world. Twitter brought this world to us in real time. And YouTube allowed anyone with a smartphone to become a virtual broadcast network onto themselves. It was glorious and empowering. But that was yesterday. Today, it's 1984 all over again. Big Brother's back with an important twist. Our former liberators now want to be our masters. Apple, Google, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, the giants of social media, are demanding conformity to their values. It's their way or the highway. Conform or die. This image is perfectly captured not by an ad, but by this recent real-life scene. Row after row of men and women stare up at Tim Cook, Apple's CEO, as he makes a presentation, ironically before a civil rights group. We only have one message for those who seek to push hate, division, and violence. You have no place on our platforms, Cook tells his audience. You have no home here. Hate? Division? According to whom? The answer is obvious. According to Apple, Google, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. They are becoming the Big Brother Orwell foresaw. Conform or die. Cook's ideas are exactly the same as his fellow chief executives at Google, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Disagree with Big Brother on, say, politics or morality, and Big Brother will shut you up by shutting you down. And what is it that Big Brother doesn't like? Well, Tim Cook said it. Anything that doesn't conform to his left-wing worldview. The examples are numerous and growing. Meghan Murphy, a Canadian feminist, is permanently banned from Twitter for refusing to refer to the transgendered by their preferred pronoun and for writing, "Women aren't men." Google, Facebook, and Twitter all at various times refused to carry political ads from Tennessee Republican candidate Marsha Blackburn promoting her conservative views. She's hardly the only one this has happened to. And as many of you know, YouTube continues to restrict over 100 of PragerU's videos, finding them inappropriate for children. These include titles like, "Why Did America Fight the Korean War?" Broad-based studies by the American Institute for Behavioral Research and Technology and by Northwestern University have confirmed what these examples clearly suggest: bias against conservatives at Google and other big tech sites. And this is the bias we can plainly see. What we don't see, what Big Brother hides from us, what is referred to as shadow banning, may be even more pernicious. If you're on the left, maybe you're okay with this. But if you're not on the left, or even if you are and you revere the First Amendment, you should be concerned, very concerned. We are advancing swiftly toward an Orwellian 1984 world of stifling one way of thinking conformity. This time, it's not a fictional story. It's real. What's the solution? Simply return to the open market of ideas that served big tech so well for so long. Stop the censorship and let people make up their own minds. Otherwise, America and the rest of what has been known as the free world will cease to be free. That's how serious the big tech threat is. I'm Brent Bozell, founder of the Media Research Center for Prager University.
How important is free speech on a college campus? Here's what the Supreme Court said in 1957 in the landmark case Sweezy v. New Hampshire. Teachers and students must always remain free to inquire, otherwise our civilization will stagnate and die. Inspiring words, and true. Which is why what's happening in American colleges and universities is so disturbing. A study conducted by the Association of American Colleges and Universities in 2010 revealed that only 30% of college seniors strongly agreed with the question, is it safe to hold unpopular positions on this campus? Worse, the study found that students' confidence that they can hold unpopular opinions declines from freshman to senior year. How can it be that at a place where speech should be the most free, the university, young people fear merely holding, to say nothing of actually expressing, unpopular opinions? The reason is that for decades now, students have been sent a clear message from their schools. Express dissenting opinions, violate political correctness, or even just criticize the administration at your peril. After working for 12 years at the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, I have seen hundreds of examples of students in peril. Here are just a few. At Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, a student employee was found guilty of racial harassment for publicly reading a book that some of his fellow employees found offensive. The book was Notre Dame versus the Klan, and it was available in the school's library. It recounted and celebrated the defeat of the Ku Klux Klan when its members marched on Notre Dame in 1924. So what did the university find offensive? The photo on the book's cover. At the University of Delaware, students were forced to undergo Ideological Re-Education as part of the university's compulsory student orientation program. The program was described as treatment for students with incorrect attitudes and beliefs. Students were taught to adopt highly specific, university-approved views on politics, race, sexuality, sociology, moral philosophy, and environmentalism. They were also required to attend one-on-one meetings with their resident assistants, where they were compelled to answer intrusive, probing, and utterly irrelevant personal questions such as, when did you discover your sexual identity? And an increasing number of schools are trying to drive religious students off campus. Vanderbilt University, for example, has enacted a policy that forbids faith-based student groups from selecting members and leaders based on their faith. As a result, 14 Christian groups have been de-recognized by the university. Then there are speech codes at a majority of American colleges and universities. What is a speech code? It is a university regulation or policy that limits or bans expression, written or verbal, that is protected under the First Amendment. Such codes are applied with glaring double standards against religious, conservative, or politically incorrect speech, or simply speech that a particular campus administration happens to dislike. In other words, there are things you are completely free to say and write off campus that will get you in serious trouble if you say or write them on campus. These codes include policies that ban speech that administrators find insulting or offensive. One absurd code that appeared at multiple universities banned inappropriately directed laughter. And in Orwellian fashion, some schools even limit free speech to tiny sections of campus called free speech zones. Recently, at the University of Central Arkansas, you were subject to disciplinary action if you said or did something deemed annoying to another student. In the most extensive study yet conducted of campus speech codes, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education found that 62% of America's top colleges maintain serious restrictions on written and verbal expression that violate First Amendment protections. What are the consequences of all this censorship by colleges and universities? I explain that in detail in my book, Unlearning Liberty, Campus Censorship and the End of American Debate. But for our purposes here, I will focus on just three. First, campus censorship teaches students that they have a right not to be offended. The moment society says that people have the right not to be offended, it has announced the end of the right to free speech. Second, campus censorship teaches students poor intellectual habits. It teaches them not to think critically lest they arrive at a conclusion or express a thought that might offend someone. Further, students are taught to ignore the timeless principle that educated people should actively seek out intelligent people with whom they disagree for debate and discussion. And third, it teaches students that they have fewer rights than they actually have, that they must defer to arbitrary authority. A generation of students who don't know their rights and believe they must get permission before speaking their minds is not thinking like a free people, and that is a threat to a free society. The rights embodied in the First Amendment shape American society. They foster America's religious and cultural pluralism, spur scientific and scholarly innovation, and thus secure our remarkable prosperity. But today's universities, with their censorship, speech codes, and political correctness, are putting the future of this unique experiment in freedom at risk. This is the very opposite of what American higher education was founded to do. I'm Greg Lukianoff, President of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education for Prager University.
Shutting down people you don't agree with is about as un-American as you can get. Rigorous debate, honest discussion, open exchange of ideas, that's the American way. But free thinking and speech are threatened today by a group with a sweet-sounding name that conceals a nefarious purpose. This group is called the Southern Poverty Law Center, or SPLC. Originally founded as a civil rights law firm in 1971, the SPLC reinvented itself in the mid-'80s as a political attack group. Every year now, it produces a new list of people and charities it claims are extremists and haters. Aided by glowing coverage from the establishment media, the SPLC's hate list has become a weapon for taking individuals and groups they disagree with and tarring them with ugly associations. The SPLC employs a two-pronged strategy. First, find a handful of crazies with barely any followers, no address, and no staff, and blow them up into a dangerous movement. Proof that there are neo-Nazis lurking everywhere. On their notorious hate map, the SPLC lists 917 separate hate groups in the U.S. No one has even heard of more than a handful of them. The second strategy of the SPLC is to undermine legitimate political voices that they oppose by associating them with extremists like the KKK. Take the charity known as the Alliance Defending Freedom. The SPLC lists them as a hate group. Is that fair? Well, the ADF has a network of 3,000 attorneys from all across the U.S. who've donated more than 1 million volunteer hours in defense of religious liberty. They've had a role in 49 victories at the U.S. Supreme Court. Putting the Alliance Defending Freedom on a list with 130 Ku Klux Klan chapters is not only wrong, it's malicious. According to the SPLC, one of the most influential social scientists in the U.S., Charles Murray, is a, quote, white nationalist. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, perhaps the most eloquent spokesperson for the rights of Muslim women, is to the SPLC a toxic anti-Muslim extremist. Scores of other individuals and charities active in mainstream conservative or religious causes have likewise been branded by the Southern Poverty Law Center as threats to society. Mind you, it is entirely fair to disagree with any of those folks, but it is utterly unfair to call them haters or extremists. The largest category listed by the SPLC as extremists, with 623 entries, covers groups like the Tea Party organizations that are wary of centralized government. Last time we checked, favoring smaller government was a mainstream and perfectly honorable American tradition. What is not honorable is the course prescribed by a leader of the SPLC, Mark Potok, who was caught on video proclaiming the organization's true intentions. He told a group of supporters, quote, "The press will describe us as monitoring hate groups. I want to say plainly that our aim in life is to destroy these groups, to completely destroy them. Portraying someone with political views different from your own as a public menace is bullying, and it's a dangerous game. Instead of reducing hate and violence, the SPLC's name-calling directly incites it. In March 2017, Charles Murray was trying to discuss his acclaimed book Coming Apart at Middlebury College when he was violently attacked by protesters inflamed by the SPLC's labeling of him as a racist. A professor escorting Murray ended up in the hospital. In 2012, a gunman attempted mass murder at the Family Research Council and failed only because the first man he shot managed to disarm him. The attacker told the police he acted because the SPLC had listed the Family Research Council as a hate group. It's a vicious irony. While promoting itself as a monitor of hate groups, the SPLC has in practice become a fomentor of hate. Yet the group rolls on, bigger than ever. What keeps them going? For one thing, the establishment media constantly quote them. Scare stories about right-wing stormtroopers are a sure way to attract eyeballs and fit nicely with the media's own preconceptions of the dangerous reactionaries lurking out there in Middle America. Second, alarmism is a great fundraising technique. Convincing people there are fascists everywhere has turned the SPLC into a cash machine. Last year, the group hustled $50 million out of frightened liberal donors, adding to the $368 million of assets they were already sitting on. So, the next time you see the Southern Poverty Law Center quoted in the news, just remember, the masterminds behind the SPLC aren't eliminating hate, they are fueling it. I'm Carl Zinsmeister for Prager University.
I used to be a senior software engineer at Google, until they fired me, for doing something unforgivable, something so controversial that it was the #1 news story for days. My crime? I wrote an internal document that, among other things, suggested that men and women, on average, are different. Like I told you, unforgivable. The politically progressive viewpoint, which is dominant at Google and in the media, is that all disparities in society are due to injustices, or in this case, that the gender gap in tech is solely due to some form of sexism. But is this true? The politically correct answer is yes, and Google acts accordingly. It treats men and women differently during hiring and promotion, holds official women-only events, and gives mandatory sensitivity training on how to combat alleged sexist bias. Of course, all of this makes sense if sexism is indeed the sole cause of the imbalance. But what if men and women are not exactly the same? Then sexism is just one of many possible causes of the imbalance. And exclusionary programs and differential treatment can be a counterproductive form of sexism. These practices actually increase tensions and make some feel like Google cares more about their gender than their programming ability. As an engineer, when I'm faced with a problem, I want to solve it. So I decided to research the premise that men and women are exactly the same. I wrote my findings in a 10-page document titled Google's Ideological Echo Chamber. You can read it online. What did I discover? That not all of the male-female disparity in tech may be the result of sexism, that at least some of it may be attributed to men and women having different goals for their careers and their lives. To cite just 2 examples, in the study Women, Careers, and Work-Life Preferences, published in the British Journal of Guidance and Counseling, the study's authors conclude that women, across populations, tend to look for more work-life balance, while men tend to have a higher drive for status. And according to a study by Cal State Fullerton psychologist Richard Lippa, men, on average, tend to be more interested in things, while women tend to be more interested in people. These findings have been replicated many times. They've actually been cited by other researchers as a cause for the gender gap in tech. In other words, I didn't make this stuff up. In fact, after my document came under attack, evolutionary psychologist Jeffrey Miller said its empirical claims were scientifically accurate. But Google disagreed. Like, really disagreed. First, the company's newly appointed VP of Diversity, Integrity, and Governance, Danielle Brown, posted a memo that said my report advanced incorrect assumptions about gender. Google CEO Sundar Pichai sent a memo to all employees saying that I crossed the line by advancing harmful gender stereotypes. This was, he added, not okay. Then he fired me. By that point, much to my shock, my document had gone viral. News outlets were branding it an anti-diversity manifesto. But if they had read what I wrote, they could see for themselves that it was pro-diversity. I suggested multiple ways that we could get more women into tech without resorting to counterproductive discrimination. Ironic, isn't it? The company that hires some of the smartest people in the world couldn't handle a well-reasoned scientific discussion. But my firing pales in comparison to the larger issue. Will Google force upon its users the same politically correct views that it forces upon its employees? The evidence is disturbing. Google already manipulates its products to fit a certain viewpoint. Just one example, YouTube, Google's video platform, restricts access to dozens of PragerU videos, along with videos made by other influential moderates and conservatives. Yes, Google is a business and can set its own policies, but for its billions of users, Google is their main gateway to information, the lens through which they view the world. This makes Google, in some ways, more powerful than even the government. And that means Google has a special responsibility to, well, simply follow its own motto, don't be evil. I'm James Damore for Prager University.
How indignant can progressives make themselves? There's a real competition going on, and it's sweeping the nation. Progressive versus progressive, competing to see who can most flamboyantly claim to be offended, to proclaim that their feelings have been hurt, or that their sensitivities have been rubbed raw, or their serenity disturbed, or their composure discombobulated by something that someone has said, or by something they have seen, such as a Confederate flag, or a building named after Woodrow Wilson. But, actually, I think progressives are not sufficiently imaginative. There are many more things they could be indignant about, starting with where I live, Washington, D.C. The Washington Post newspaper is, if it will pardon the expression, on the warpath against the name of the Washington Redskins football team. The paper says the name is racist, insulting, demeaning, insensitive, and so on. But the Washington Post takes its name from its city, which is named for George Washington, who was not only a slave owner, he was a tobacco farmer, which some progressives probably think is almost as awful. No way! Surely the Post should change its name and should demand that the nation's capital be renamed, perhaps as Eleanor Roosevelt City. Obviously, it cannot be named for her husband, he who ordered the internment of 117,000 persons of Japanese descent, 2/3 of whom were native-born American citizens. And there are hundreds of other towns, counties, parks, and schools named for Washington, such as Washington and Lee University. Good grief, the name is double hate speech. Robert E. Lee actually commanded the Confederate Army. Washington is not the only name progressives should scrutinize. The word Oklahoma is a compound of two words from the Choctaw language, words meaning red and people. If it is intolerable to have a football team named Redskins, it must be worse to have a state named Red People. But let's get back to cleansing America of all mentions of historic figures who were less than perfect progressives. On the Tidal Basin in Washington, there's a memorial to the slave-owning Thomas Jefferson. This memorial should have a trigger warning carved into its marble. Jacksonville, Florida, and Jackson, Mississippi, and many other places and things are named for Andrew Jackson, the tormentor of Native Americans. All must be renamed for someone who was saintly as progressives understand saintliness. And speaking of saints, surely good progressives are traumatized by the names of St. Louis, St. Petersburg, San Diego, San Antonio, not to mention Corpus Christi. Progressives like it when courts rule that non-denominational prayers at high school graduations violate the separation of church and state. Why then don't they consider it a constitutional outrage that there are cities named for religious figures, including Nancy Pelosi's San Francisco? That city is, if progressives will pardon the expression, the Vatican of American progressivism. Progressives should demand that all such cities be renamed for progressive saints. Tony Bennett could sing, "I left my heart in Nancy Pelosi City." Or we could give these places names that give no offense because they have no meaning. Joseph Nippenberg is an American rarity, a sensible professor. His droll suggestion is that we spare progressives from discomfort by giving cities and buildings the kind of meaningless names that are given to car models, names such as Acura and Elantra and Sentra. And what about the state flag of hyper-progressive Massachusetts? Its flag depicts a Native American holding, brace yourself, a bow and arrow, a weapon. Surely progressivism's sensitivity police cannot permit this depiction. It reinforces the hurtful stereotype of Native Americans as less than perfectly peaceful people. Minnesota, too, should hang its head in shame. Its state seal depicts a pioneer tilling a field and a Native American riding away and carrying a spear. Any progressive can see that this seal conveys multiple racial slurs. The spear, another weapon, another stereotype of Native Americans as violent. The Native American riding away is stigmatized as nomadic, hence unproductive, whereas the farmer who is white is industrious. So, the seal communicates subliminal slander, the coded message of white superiority. Who knew that Minnesotans who have voted Democratic in 10 consecutive elections since 1972 embrace white supremacy? I could go on, but you get the picture. Still, you should feel sorry for the progressive sensitivity enforcers. Those who constantly find reason to take offense are rarely happy people. The problem, however, is that such people make almost everyone else miserable too. I'm George Will for Prager University.
Tolerance. It's a word we hear a lot these days, so let's define it. Tolerance is the ability to live with people whose opinions and behavior you don't agree with. That's essentially how Oxford defines it, how Merriam-Webster defines it, and how we as a society have always defined it. You might be for the death penalty and your cousin might be against it. You might be against a $15 minimum wage and your coworker might be for it. Your dad might have voted for Trump, your mom might have voted for Clinton, and your brother may not have voted at all. Whatever differences we have, tolerating others' opinions is a prerequisite to a functioning and free society. America itself was built on a foundation of tolerance. The Declaration of Independence guarantees us life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But there's an implicit contract there. To have your life, your liberty, and your pursuit of happiness, you have to be tolerant of somebody else's life, their liberty, and their pursuit of happiness. This contract, though, seems to be breaking down. If you listen to the mainstream media, only one side is living up to this deal, the left. The right, according to the media, is intolerant of everyone, except those darned white heterosexual Christian males. There's only one problem. It's just not true. Incredibly, the left isn't even tolerant of the very people they say they're tolerant of. If you're gay or black or an immigrant and you're not in lockstep with current leftist orthodoxy, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you believe we should judge people on the content of their character and not the color of their skin, the left calls you racist. If you believe that America is a nation of immigrants, but that our country should also protect its borders, the left calls you a xenophobe. If you believe that men and women are equal but fundamentally different, the left calls you sexist. Here's the thing, those who only tolerate people they agree with or like aren't actually tolerant. So who is tolerant? Is it the organizers of the Women's March who had to apologize for the hurt and confusion they caused when they invited a man, leftist icon Bernie Sanders, to speak at their convention? Is it the Antifa thugs who caused UC Berkeley to spend $600,000 on security when mainstream conservative Ben Shapiro showed up to give a talk? Or is it Democratic Congresswoman Maxine Waters who scolded Kanye West for talking out of turn when he dared suggest that blacks should think for themselves? These aren't isolated examples. I'm guessing that you, person watching this right now, have silenced yourself because you don't want to suffer the wrath of the outrage mob. So let me ask the question again. Who is tolerant? Well, here's the surprise. It's actually those scary right-wingers that the media and the universities demonize every day. I speak from personal experience. Maybe I'm a glutton for punishment here, but I still consider myself a liberal. And it's my duty as a liberal to say what I think. I would rather stand for what I believe and be hated than bow down and be loved. The left, sadly, has become utterly intolerant of anyone with whom they disagree. Why? Because they believe that they know how you should live and how you should think. Any deviation, any nonconformity is dangerous to that goal. Believe it or not, the right these days actually welcomes diversity of thought. I can tell you that in the last few years of my political evolution, I've consistently found conservatives to be tolerant and open-minded. Don't take my word for it, though. Test it out for yourself. Go talk to some. They do exist, and they do things like watch movies, travel, and eat ethnic food. You know, regular people things. You know what I found out? The right, much more than the left, believes in the notion of live and let live. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the true definition of tolerance. I'm Dave Rubin of The Rubin Report for Prager University.
Vanderbilt University, November 2015. 200 students rise up to protest the white privilege and microaggressions of the racist, bigoted Vanderbilt administration. The protesters don't offer any specific examples of discrimination, but that doesn't matter. What matters is that they feel victimized. The next day, a bag of dog poop shows up at the front door of the university's Black Cultural Center. All hell breaks loose. Full of righteous indignation, student activist groups rush to Facebook to denounce the racist act. The police investigate. They quickly find the person responsible, but nobody is arrested. You know why? Because it turns out that the bag of excrement wasn't a racist attack. It was left by a blind girl with a service dog. She couldn't find a trash can, so, wanting to do the responsible thing, she left the bag outside the door of a nearby building, knowing a janitor would pick it up and throw it away. The student group did apologize, but then they added another charge against the administration. The needs of students with disabilities on this campus are also marginalized. Seriously, this is not a joke. On the college campus today, feelings rule facts and victims are heroes. According to the left, all inequality in America is due to victimization. They start by claiming that all non-white people in America are victims of white privilege. Then come women. They're all victims of the patriarchy. Then come gays and lesbians and the transgendered. They're all victims of our heteronormative and homophobic society. But what if you haven't actually been victimized by anybody? That doesn't matter. To the left, so long as you feel victimized, you're a victim. Even if you have never actually experienced discrimination, you've surely been targeted by microaggressions. You know, nasty little words and phrases that weren't meant to be insults, but just are. If somebody asks you, where are you from? That's considered a xenophobic microaggression. They're implying that you are a foreigner. If a man holds open a door for a woman, which, by the way, you're supposed to do, that's a sexist microaggression because he's treating her like she's a helpless female. Of course, he's also treating her like she's a woman. But how would he know? And heaven forbid anybody address you by your biologically accurate pronoun. What if she identifies as a man? In short, everyone's a victim, except, of course, straight white males. Also, anybody who dares to disagree with the left. If you're guilty of either of those crimes, you must be confronted, even if doing so requires actual aggression, like, say, a riot. Here's a trick the left plays to justify their violence. First, they say it's okay to punch Nazis. Then they say that every conservative, in fact, everybody they disagree with, is a Nazi. But here's the biggest problem with the left's argument. They're based on feelings, not facts. Take white privilege. The only real privilege in America is American privilege. Everybody in America has it, more than citizens of any other country in the world, the privilege to make your own decisions and live the life you choose. According to the liberal Brookings Institution, if you make just these 3 decisions, you'll do fine. And with drive and ambition, you'll probably do better than fine. First, finish high school. Second, don't have babies before you're married. Third, hold down a job. If you do these 3 things, you'll be on your way to the privilege of middle-class life, regardless of race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, or gender. Also, there's no patriarchy. Women already make up the majority of college graduates. According to Time magazine, young single women without kids already earn more than their male counterparts. Oh, and gay and lesbian couples, they earn more than their straight counterparts too. These are facts, and facts don't care about your feelings. Neither will your employer if you get a job after you leave school. The moment you graduate, reality is going to hit you like a truck. People who give you a paycheck expect you to produce. They expect you to work hard. And all the claims of victimhood, all the whining, well, nobody cares. So, stop worrying so much about your feelings and start worrying a little more about being a good person, doing your best, and not getting in your own way. If you don't, the only thing you'll be a victim of is yourself. I'm Ben Shapiro, editor of the Daily Wire for Prager University.
You are looking at a dangerous person. You may feel unsafe, even threatened by my very existence. What is this power I possess? It's called free speech. While I knew it was always there, I recently discovered its true value. Here's my story. It could easily be yours. I'm a journalist, an author, and a podcaster. I live in Portland, Oregon. My husband owns a few local coffee shops and a small coffee roasting business called Ristretto Roasters. In December 2018, I started a YouTube podcast entitled #MeNeither. The show's About page reads, Me Neither is an almost weekly conversation about the cultural issues of the day and an attempt to create a space where people can find ways to think out loud through uncomfortable topics. One of those topics is the Metoo Movement and what I see as some of its excesses, including celebrities who exploit Metoo for personal gain. Sexual assault and harassment are real, but the idea that any charge any woman or man brings must be believed without question, where's the logic in that? I believe we are better off judging any claim of harassment, like any other claim, on its own merits. This, I would learn, is not a popular position. It turned out one of the people tuning into my new show was a former employee of my husband's coffee business. She claimed my views were vile, dangerous, and extremely misguided, and in an email to the press, claimed my opinions created a demoralizing and hostile environment for employees. Why would the opinions of the wife of the boss demoralize an employee? No one bothered to ask that question. That I appeared to be on the wrong side of the Me Too debate was all people needed to know. By the time you could say Twitter, a social media mob formed to say they would never spend another penny at my husband's business. A college-age girl stormed into one of the cafes, screaming variously that the baristas were in danger and that their working at the cafe posed a threat to the community. Employees previously secure in their jobs grew jittery and quit. One suggested that my husband sell the company and that I offer a public apology before it was too late. This all happened within the first 48 hours. As the outrage grew, local businesses that make up a big part of my husband's base cut and run. Wholesale customers canceled large accounts, afraid they'd be caught in the Me Too crossfire. Staff now worried that they'd lose their jobs and health insurance if Ristretto were forced to close, that I, a person with whom they'd heretofore had a perfectly congenial relationship, might in fact be a secret monster, a rape culture apologist. Many of those who claimed to have been offended had not seen the podcast. One woman wrote, I clicked, downvoted, then reported on YouTube that it violates community guidelines. Hateful. I didn't listen, but it's one way to make that expletive go away. This kind of uninformed virtual attack strikes me as childish, the behavior of a toddler whose tantrum brings a dinner party to a halt until it's placated with the attention it seeks. I invited my critics to speak with me. The whole point of Me Neither is to provoke discussion. No one took me up on my offer. It was evidently easier for so-called feminists to tell my husband to leave his wife or lose his business, for some random dude on Facebook to send me the message, you are scum, rotten hell, you dirty, just use your imagination, than to honestly confront me. I can't help but think that those who engage in this kind of behavior are steering themselves into perpetually unhappy waters, that they live in fear that everyone and everything is out to get them, so therefore they must strike first. Or are they addicted to the feeling that what they are doing is righteous, not considering intolerance in the name of tolerance is a frightening contradiction and solves nothing? Or maybe they think they are making progress. But if this is progress, one might reasonably ask, for whom and to what end? It's also contrary to what is most fundamental to America, that every citizen has the equal right to voice his or her opinion and to express these opinions in a public forum. My story is one of many, another cautionary tale for those who get pulled into the culture wars. I understand why most people want to stay out of it. It's scary to fight for liberty and against a mob. The whole thing is exhausting. I've repeatedly been asked, usually in "you should have known better" tones, if I'm going to stop having nuanced conversations about sensitive subjects. The answer is absolutely not. And if that makes you feel unsafe, too bad. I'm Nancy Rommelman, journalist and author for Prager University.
I'm always telling my daughter stories from when I was a kid. By comparison, the world of my youth was rougher and meaner than the world that kids grow up in today. So here's my question. Did this rougher and meaner world better prepare me to be a well-adjusted, happy adult? I say yes. When I was a kid, you could say we were less sensitive about a lot of things. I mean, just look at the commercials we watched. We had the Frito Bandito, the cartoon spokesman for Fritos. He was a 3.5-foot tall Mexican thief. Can you imagine pitching that at an ad agency today? The Frito Bandito, okay. All right, Phil, you don't work here anymore. Yeah, you gotta go clean out your desk right now. Some were violent. Hawaiian Punch, every commercial was the same. A cartoon Hawaiian character walks up to an unsuspecting cartoon tourist and says, "Hey, how about a nice Hawaiian punch?" "Sure," says the tourist, which gets him punched directly in the face. We all thought that was hilarious. Kids had to be tougher then, too. An occasional playground fight was expected. And as for teasing, my mom had a remedy for that. "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me." She used to say that all the time. One of the seemingly endless adages she had at her disposal to deal with any of life's problems. But I'd think long and hard about the practical applications that statement had on my life. That's true, I thought. If someone punches you in the chest, it hurts no matter what. But with words, it all depends on how you think about it. You could actually choose whether or not to be hurt. You can't choose whether or not a punch hurts, but you can choose whether or not words hurt. That was huge. Even though it had been repeated ad nauseum for generations, Sticks and Stones really was a powerful bit of philosophy to a kid. That's one of the great things about being a parent. You can spout cliches till the cows come home, and yet, to your child, it's all new. You come off as one of the great thinkers in Western culture. But does anyone really say sticks and stones anymore? I doubt there's a grammar school teacher today who's even allowed to utter that phrase. They're much more likely to warn against the ever-present danger of hate speech or triggers or hurting people's feelings. This is done in the name of teaching children to respect each other. It begins innocently enough by trying to eradicate teasing, but it continues into middle and high school where there's no greater sin than offending someone's personal or cultural sensitivity. We've seen what used to be called great books banned because of fear of offending. That would not have even occurred to us years ago. Of course, how could the physical abuse in The Great Gatsby harm us in high school when we spent our childhood watching Jerry the Mouse staple gun Tom the Cat's tongue to the wall? How could reading an honest depiction of racial attitudes in The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn harm us when we sang "Ay, ay, ay, ay" along with the Frito Bandito? Or fat kids, skinny kids, kids who climb on rocks, tough kids, sissy kids. They said sissy kids. Even kids with chicken pox, we sang that along with the Armour hot dog kids on our TV sets. Now people look back and some feel ashamed that teasing was expected in childhood. And stereotypes were commonplace in our culture. But was growing up in that environment worse than the hypersensitive culture we live in now? I look at the rough and tumble of childhood and the process of learning to deal with bullying and being insulted as a process of inoculation. After each instance of being offended and then repeating my mother's sticks and stones philosophy, it was like a vaccine that built up my immune system. Eventually, you're resistant. And often, you weren't even aware it was happening. I can't imagine my college-age self living in fear of microaggressions. Yet today, there are full-time campus administrators whose job involves scrubbing the campus curriculum and social life of anything that might offend anyone. And these are college students, ostensible adults, headed into the job market. I don't want to offend anyone with a microaggression if they're holding a scalpel. I try to laugh it off. I don't want my outrage to match theirs. The best thing I can do is tell my stories to my kids and remind them that sticks and stones may break their bones, but names will never hurt them. They think I wrote it. I'm Tom Shalhoub for Prager University.
It's appalling that, in the 21st century, there is still so little diversity on American college campuses. This cannot stand. It's not who we are. It's intolerable. It's time we demand a change. It's time to stage a protest, to storm the dean's office. We will not be ignored. Diversity is our strength. I'm not talking about diversity of skin color. Been there, done that. Today's campuses are more racially integrated than at any time in history. And I'm not talking about gender diversity. Women already make up the majority of college graduates. And if your concern is non-binary gender, there is no place on earth more accepting of hims, hers, zims, and zers than a college campus. I'm not even talking about sexual diversity. You can pretty much experiment with anyone you want, in any way you want, as long as you get a consent form signed and notarized in advance. No, the diversity I'm talking about is diversity of thought. Let me say it again in case you missed it. Diversity of thought. That's right. People expressing different points of view on an issue. At most colleges today, that's a dangerous, revolutionary idea if that different point of view is not on the left. The moment you enter college, you enter an indoctrination center. Remember orientation week? It starts there and never stops. They tell you to be open-minded, but they don't really mean it. Almost all your professors are on the left, nearly 12-to-1, left to right, according to a recent study by Econo Journal Watch. There are many departments at many colleges that don't have a single conservative voice. The administration invariably supports leftist positions. And all those diversity administrators, they depend for their livelihood, that means their paycheck, on creating victims. Diversity of race, or gender, or sexuality, or any of the other distinctions du jour that universities glorify are, at best, superficial, and at worst, just plain destructive. It's destructive to any real learning. If you don't study Shakespeare because he was a white male, you have been deprived of learning from the most brilliant playwright who ever lived. And it's destructive of a peaceful campus environment because it pits racial, ethnic, and gender groups against one another. In other words, diversity, as practiced on your typical college campus, divides, not unites people. And diversity of thought, the free exchange of ideas, you know, what college is actually supposed to be about, not happening. If you've been in college for a few years, ask yourself this. When was the last time you heard a professor or a TA make the argument that capitalism has lifted more people out of poverty than any other economic system? Or that socialism always leads to poverty? Or that the post-World War II order created by America has been the freest and most prosperous time in human history? Or that the cause of high crime rates in black communities has very little to do with historic racism? And God forbid if a conservative speaker should show up on campus and dare say any of these things. If the ideas of the people on the right have so little merit, why bother to protest? Shouldn't their bad ideas just die on their own? Isn't the purpose of a liberal education to expose students to differing points of view? Turns out that the liberal in liberal education means leftist. Here's how the University of California at Berkeley, the pinnacle of political correctness, describes itself. Our goal is to transform UC Berkeley into an equitable and inclusive academy of the highest caliber, one that fully honors the diversity of our students, faculty, and staff. Give me a break. Berkeley needs to be transformed. It's not diverse enough. After all these years of expanding equity and inclusion, bull crap. It positively reeks of sexist heteropatriarchy. Say that 3 times.
I don't know what it means, but it sure sounds bad. Walk around the Berkeley campus, or almost any campus, and you'll see plenty of blacks, Hispanics, gays, lesbians, even a straight white guy or two. College is a place where they want everyone to look different, but think exactly the same. It's like a freaking cult. At some point, you have to stand up, separate yourself from the crowd, and say, enough. It's time to diversify thought on campus. It's time to demand a real education. God knows you're paying for it. I'm Charlie Kirk, president of Turning Point USA for Prager University.
In my many years in Washington, the most alarming development has been advertised under the soothing title of campaign finance reform. We Americans are disposed to think that the word reform is a synonym for improvement. But what is called campaign finance reform is nothing less than a frontal assault on the first, the most fundamental of our freedoms, the freedom to speak our minds and to participate in politics. This assault is always conducted stealthily by people who pretend that they only want to regulate money, not speech. They say they are only concerned about the quantity of money in politics. After the 2012 Romney and Obama campaigns spent combined $2 billion, the usual cry was heard from reformers. They said, there is too much money in politics. Forget the fact that Americans spend $2 billion every spring just on Easter candy, but you must remember this. People who say there is too much money in politics are necessarily saying three very sinister things. First, they are saying there is too much political speech. Second, they are saying that they know just the right amount of political speech. And third, they are saying that government should enforce the limits they want on the amount of political speech. That is, the government should regulate speech about the government. Over the last few decades, reformers have chipped away at the First Amendment guarantee of free speech. They've done it with various and sundry campaign finance laws, such as limiting the amount of money an individual can give to a candidate. But they're no longer satisfied with merely chipping away at the First Amendment. Now they want to take a sledgehammer to it. They admit that what they want, to restrict free speech, is incompatible with the Constitution. So, for the first time in American history, reformers, calling themselves progressives, are proposing to change the First Amendment in order to empower Congress to decide the quantity, content, and timing of political speech. And who would benefit from the speech-restricting rules Congress would write? Well, we know this. Every campaign finance law that ever has existed or ever will exist has been or will be written by incumbent legislators. That is, all laws regulating campaigns will favor the re-election of incumbents. Incumbents have enormous electoral advantages stemming from their perquisites of office, name recognition, a catalog of favors done for constituents, and so on. Hence, incumbents generally do not need to spend as much money as their challengers must spend. Hence, incumbents write laws making fundraising more difficult. Those who advocate restricting how much money we can contribute to candidates or how much money candidates can spend on campaigns always say the same thing. They say we are only restricting money, and money is not speech. To see how silly this distinction is, consider the following. The New York Times constantly says that money is not speech, and therefore the spending of money can be restricted without restricting freedom of speech. But suppose conservatives controlled Congress and said to the New York Times, we, of course, would never restrict the freedom of the Times to practice journalism, heaven forbid. We are only going to restrict the amount of money the Times can spend on gathering the news and distributing its newspapers, the amount it can spend on journalists, paper, ink, printing presses, delivery trucks, advertisements, and so on. Do you think the New York Times would be content with this? Would the Times say, that's fine because you are only regulating our right to spend money, not our right to speak? No. The Times would strenuously object. It would say, money is indispensable for making our speech effective. That is true, and not just for the Times. Without ample money, no congressional candidate can speak to an entire congressional district. And no Senate candidate can communicate to an entire state. And no presidential candidate can make his or her case to our continental nation. Contributing to candidates is one of the most common forms of political participation. So, restricting campaign contributions reduces participation. The only constitutional way to reduce the amount of money invested in politics is to reduce the role of politics in the distribution of money. If government were not so big, if it were not so busy allocating wealth and opportunity to the politically well-connected, then politics would be less important in our lives and less money would be spent on it. So, the next time someone says we should make government even bigger by giving it the power to regulate speech, tell that person that what we really need is more speech advocating less government. I'm George Will for Prager University.
Do you like being able to speak your mind freely or practice whatever religion you want? People in America take these rights for granted, but these rights only exist because of the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights. The First Amendment states, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peacefully to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. America is the most free and most prosperous country in the world. But why is America different, and why should we preserve these values? Let's take a look. 1. The First Amendment protects the free exercise of religion. If you are a Muslim, a Christian, an atheist, you can freely practice your beliefs in America. The founders did not believe that religion should be divorced from politics, but they prohibited the government from establishing a national church. You see, liberty can only be kept if Americans remain a good and moral people, and the Constitution promotes the free exercise of religion. It doesn't eliminate religion. 2. Freedom of speech is one of the most important rights in our Constitution. It allows Americans to speak their opinions without fear of punishment or regulation. This means the First Amendment not only protects speech that is widely accepted, it also protects speech that isn't popular. In fact, freedom of speech would be meaningless if it only protected speech that we all liked. 3. I'm sure you've heard all about fake news in the media recently, but what if that fake news was coming directly from your government? This is why we have a free and independent press. The press searches for truth and promotes virtue and unity. The press is also a check on the government and helps to advance American values. 4. The First Amendment also protects the right for people to gather peacefully. It guarantees the right for citizens to petition the government to protest or give an opinion on an issue. So all these people you see marching in the streets with picket signs for God knows what are only able to do so because of the First Amendment. America is a country where citizens can practice their faith and speak and gather freely without government intervention. These freedoms, guaranteed under the First Amendment, are critical, and we must preserve them at any cost. I'm Will Witt.